to you. This is similar to a memes panel, except all these jokes are bad. No, everybody, welcome to the Writing for Horror panel. Oh, I'm up there. How about that? Yeah, I'm Mr. Creepypasta. Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody out there on Twitch. Yeah, everybody can go around the room and tell me your names. Now, if you guys don't know who I am, I'm an internet narrator on YouTube. I make a living entertaining people with my mouth and throat by narrating. I've gone through I think around 1,600 stories on my channel so far, through different kinds of stories dealing with horror, all the way from horror to comedy horror to thrillers to just straight up action dramas and things like that. So what I'm going to be talking to you guys a bit about today is what makes horror, what makes horror stories, and good jokes, dude. Yeah. What makes good horror stories, what makes up horror in general, and things like that. Because I think a lot of the time, at least what I've seen in a lot of problems with horror stories in general over the years, is that a lot of people don't really know what makes up horror. What makes things scary is something that kind of eludes a lot of us. So, music? Carpeted kitchen. Okay, you know what? Let's go with carpeted kitchen. Let's go with carpeted kitchen, because this feels like a nice springboard. Let me pull up my notes real quick. So one other thing I'm going to let you guys know about, so you guys can see this. My good friend Mew is going to be showing up in a little bit. He's going to be accompanying me. Oh, there he is. This wonderful man right here. Give him a round of applause. He is the real talent, the atmosphere. And he is going to be helping me out with a couple of things. So as is how I do shit, I'm going to be talking to you guys a little bit about what makes up horror, and then I'm going to be doing a little bit of story time with you guys, reading off different horror stories from my friend Vincent and Acaba. If you guys are cool with that, that's what we're kind of co-opting this panel into. Because as much as I really loved doing story time last night and everything, I really want to be able to do stories for more of you guys. So we're going to talk about writing for internet horror. I'm going to show you an example of that kind of horror in a story. Sound cool? Cool. I have not done that before, so hopefully you guys are going to have fun with it, and this is going to be a fun experience. So, carpeted kitchen. Carpeted kitchen, a lot of these things kind of come out of the blue, cursed images, cursed thoughts, and things like that. These creepypastas kind of come out at you, and they are very uncomfortable, and that actually is an element of horror in a certain way. One of the great elements of horror, or let me talk about this. There's three elements that essentially make up what makes things scary. There are three things, according to Stephen King, if somebody would actually believe that he is a good writer. Anybody here believes Stephen King's a good writer? Cool, you're right. So he is an authority in horror, I would like to believe. He says that horror is made up of three things, essentially, and that's it. One of them is considered to be gross-out horror. And gross-out horror is exactly that cursed image of carpeted kitchens. Because when you think about carpeted kitchens, you think about spilling liquids onto that carpeted kitchen, and then stepping onto the carpeted kitchen, and then seeing the liquid seep between your toes and things like that as you're stepping on it. So it's you got this really gross out feel, and you're seeing something or experiencing something that you don't want to see. So the way that it was described to me before, and I'm stealing a lot of these notes from my friend Vincent, but is that whenever you're in a completely dark room, if you had your eyes completely closed, and you can hear something that's wet, you can hear the dripping of something, you can smell something that's rancid in the room. It's incredibly warm and humid, and when you open your eyes, you see something in that room that you don't want to see, something that's gross, like blood, or gore, or vomit, or carpeted kitchen, and what have you. That's what you're going to be. That's the gross out level of horror, something that's going to end up making you sick. Anybody here has seen the movie Saw? I guess not the movie Saw, the series of Saw. The series of Saw really plays towards that gross-out horror. It builds tension when you're watching a woman with her hand inside of a jar and seeing that there's razor blades against her wrists. So when she tries to pull her hand out, you know you're going to see something you don't want to see. And that level of tension building is all based around that gore factor. It's all based around gross-out. This is going to be all night with this. Yeah. No, atmosphere is a really big part of this as well, and that goes towards building up that tension. I'm going to mention that in a second. Don't worry. The second thing that Stephen King mentions is actually called horror. So the first one we had gross. The second one is actually just called horror. And horror is whenever you're inside of that room, your eyes are closed, and you can hear something scraping against the walls. You could feel something move up next to you. You can feel breath on the back of your neck. And when the light comes on, when you open your eyes, you see something there that's supernatural, something that's able to hurt you, something that's able to jump out at you. You see Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, xenomorph aliens, anything like that. You see Annabelle, something that you know that can physically hurt you, or a character that you're watching in a movie. So anybody was here last night? You guys remember I did a story called The Golden Arm? Why'd you jump at the end? Because it was sudden? That's not because it was sudden, because if it was just sudden, then yeah. But the thing is, when there's a sudden sound, that means that there's something around you that can suddenly be able to get you. There's some kind of fear that something around you is actually going to happen. Like the same reason why you end up blinking your eyes or batting something away when the cotton ball comes at your face. It's not because you know that the cotton ball is going to end up killing you. It's just like, there's something coming towards me, so I'm going to react to it in that way. In this horror scenario, if there's something that I suddenly feels like in the back of my mind when building tension, that there is something that's able to hurt me, I'm going to react to it in a certain way. You have like these certain scenarios when you come down to like jump scares whenever they're done properly, but not exactly whenever they're done like a false scare. Did anybody watch the remake they did of It, the last one? There's this really, I guess I want to say it's a good false scare, but it just catches you so off guard. And that's like the sudden thing that you don't really expect. There's no built-in tension. It's just a sudden, loud noise that gets you to react to it. When Bev is cleaning the bathroom, after she's completely cleaned it, she suddenly turns to leave, and when she goes to that door, then you just see Pennywise there, and there's a sudden sound, and you don't expect it to happen because it was a completely calm scene. You had no rising tension, nothing at all, and then we get a loud noise that's startling, and that's a false scare. Those are generally what we don't like to see in horror movies. But as there's building tension, and it builds towards a certain element in your psyche that tells you that there's something that can actually be there to hurt you, it's making you start to cower inward, there's something around you, or potentially something that could hurt you, and then there's that loud noise, that's actually what you're seeing. Horror. Is that how you made that noise the other day? That's I didn't know I didn't know you had that on there. Could you play Megalovania with that? The last one, and everybody usually associates this with being a psychological horror, because everybody likes psychological horror. This is my psychological horror right here, and I'm going to explain to you why. This is my psychological horror. So psychological horror is whenever you're in that dark room, your eyes are closed, and you can smell something rancid. You can feel something moving around in the room. You can feel breath on the back of your neck, and when the lights come on, there's absolutely nothing there. Is to say that that is the tension that you feel. In truth, there's really nothing that can hurt you from something rancid. There's nothing that can hurt you from feeling breath on your neck. It's just that all these elements together, and in the back of your mind, you know that it could potentially be something, but doesn't necessarily have to actually be something. Terror comes from fear of something that is, in the end of the day, mundane. The way that Vincent likes to put it, and I think is like the best way of putting it, is like coming home and realizing that everything in your house has been replaced with an exact copy. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's something menacing, but that means that there's something very wrong. And Megalovania is very wrong. And like my growing tension is just like, every time that I know I finish saying something, he has the potential to play Megalovania. Okay.
No, not yet.
Oh, yeah, see? This is what I'm talking about. It's just like...
Because you're expecting it right now.
Yeah, no, I'm expecting, yeah. You guys ever play with Jack in the Box? Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry.
I think one of the scariest sentences that is the format is, I don't know what it is, but that's not a dog.
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but that's not a dog. Well, because there's honestly nothing wrong with it. Like if you recognize it being a dog or something like that, and it still acts like a dog, then you know that there's really nothing like harmful about it. But nonetheless, the fact that it's wrong is what makes it seem like a horror scenario. And it doesn't necessarily have to be menacing. It doesn't need to be foaming at the mouth. There doesn't need to be blood involved with it. It just needs to be wrong, and that deals with terror. Anybody get that? I'm like watching, because I'm like, yeah. God. It's like slowly pulling off a Band-Aid. He's just like, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a story here. This is a story that me and Vincent had got hired in to do. A couple years ago, we got hired by Stars to do this series with Ash vs. Evil Dead. And there's a whole bunch of stories that we got to do with them. And they were all dealt with the house on Wendell Lane, which I'm pretty sure you guys have seen as a series before. This is a really good example of mixing together the different elements of horror. What actually makes it, I don't know, never mind. Put that on hold for a second. What actually deals with making the best kind of horror story, whenever you're writing, is to not take each one of these things individually, but to mix them together into a scene or into a story that really helps to work for you. Now, I talked about like the remake of It a second ago with how it created a false scare, and that's not to say that it's a bad film in any way, because honestly, I really enjoyed it. But in the original It miniseries, it had one scene in it that I really loved that really blended together these elements. And that was when Bev first sees that bubble, that big blood bubble coming out of the sink. If anybody's not familiar with it, she's looking into the sink and she starts to see what at first looks like a big red balloon start to come out of the sink. And like your first thought whenever you're watching is that it's going to be the clown, because we all know he's got that big red nose, that red hair. It starts to grow and grow until it starts to look like a balloon, and even she's afraid of it, but she's curious by it. And when it explodes, it covers the sink and her in blood. And then she screams, her dad comes rushing in, and his hands are like in the blood looking into the sink, and he can't see it. And eventually she just says it was a spider, and he touches her face with blood on his hands, with blood on her face. He's smearing it around, he doesn't realize it, and tells her, it's going to be okay, nothing's going to hurt you. Even without the creepy shit with her dad, there is all these different elements of horror that are mixed together into this scene. One, we know that there's something there that can hurt Bev. We know there's something there that wants to kill her. And when that red nose starts to appear, that's what the initial fear, the initial tension building comes from, is that it's going to be this thing that's going to be able to hurt our main character. And as soon as that explodes into blood, then we realize it's suddenly a really gross scene. We don't want to see blood. That's generally something we don't want to see as people. And when her dad comes rushing in, he has his hands in it, and she keeps building up that gross, but he can't see it at all. So either something's wrong with him, something's wrong with her, and we don't know, or which it could be. And suddenly the tension shifts from being about being gross and shifts over to being about that. What exactly is wrong? So it changes from being a horror scenario to a gross scenario and suddenly to a terror scenario. And evenly be able to blend those things together and use all these elements because they're there for you to use. And that's one of the really big things about writing. So in this one, I think that terror and horror are used in a really interesting way. And I'm gonna give you guys the phone in the kitchen. You ready to rock and roll, homeboy? Yes. The phone in the kitchen. First of all, I'd like to say that I've enjoyed your work, and I'm happy to hear that you're thinking about writing a book about the house on Wendell Lane. And the reason I'm messaging you is because I know that you've been researching the house, and I believe I have some information that you might be interested in. I'm sending you a journal entry written by David Porter, a man who lived in the house between the years of 1984 and 1987. I will, of course, also be providing you with all the necessary documents to back my claim. Attached to that email, oh my God. Attached to that email were scans of journal entries written by David Porter that were later verified to be authentic. Many of these accounts are fairly mundane, and some make references to phone conversations he would often have with family members and friends. The nature of these discussions aren't outright odd, but they are noteworthy due to one peculiar entry from the winter of 1986 titled "The Phone in the Kitchen." I transcribed and published it here. The calls would come from the phone in the kitchen. Always the phone in the kitchen. If the other phone rang, I could expect it to be someone who was alive. But if it was just the kitchen phone, I knew the caller would be dead. They came at odd hours, too, always early morning before the dawn would break. I had known them all when they were alive. They were relatives and friends, co-workers, neighbors. Each and every one of them, people in my life who had passed on to the other side. My grandmother was one of the first calls I received. She died before I turned 12, so the two of us had a lot of catching up to do. And Nana became one of my closest confidants. I shared everything with her during our talks. All my secrets, all my hopes, aspirations. It felt like a blessing to have such a gift bestowed on me, a phone line to the afterlife. And though I couldn't dial out, someone always seemed to call when I needed them to. I was never given an explicit set of guidelines, but there were rules that all the callers followed. Never did our conversations last until daybreak. Didn't matter if one of us was in a mid-sentence. The caller always hung up the moment the sun would begin to peek out over the horizon. They always refused to speak of the afterlife. It was something I often asked about during our discussions, but each and every caller was a master at pivoting the conversation away from the topic. And lastly, I was sworn to never tell another soul about the phone in the kitchen. Even my brother Danny, who I was closest in the world with. Or else I was told the calls would cease. These were small prices to pay, of course, and a phone line to the afterlife meant that I would never truly lose anyone. I would never have to feel alone. Then my brother's accident happened and everything changed. Danny's car hit a patch of black ice on the freeway and he lost control. And by the time I got to the hospital, his wife and children were already there. My brother was in critical condition. His chance of survival slim to none. I looked into the terrified faces of his family, and I felt ashamed. I knew there was no chance that I'd be losing Danny that night. Not as long as I had the phone in the kitchen. But his wife and kids, well, he'd be gone forever. I needed to speak about it with someone who would understand, so I excused myself for a little while after the kids had fallen asleep and drove home to wait for a call. And right on cue, the phone rang, almost as soon as I walked through the door. I'd been expecting my grandmother. It always seemed to be her who called when things got serious, but when I heard the voice on the receiver, my heart sank in my chest. It was Danny, which of course could only mean one thing. My brother had passed on. By the sound of his voice, he appeared to be in a pleasant mood for someone who had just died. Now, believe it or not, Danny was more interested in counseling me than grieving over himself and his family. We spoke for an hour, and during our conversation, his words washed away my guilt. By the time our talk was over, I felt much better about myself. I thought about Danny's family, and I drove back over to the hospital. His wife was one of the most resilient people I knew, and his children were sharp as tacks. Deep down in my heart, I knew they'd persevere through the tragedy, and I vowed myself that I would be there for them if they needed me, just as my callers from the afterlife had been there for me. Still, a small part of me wanted to tell them about the phone. If only, I thought. If only I could connect them to their father one last time. When I got back to the hospital, I was surprised to see Danny's children were all smiles. His wife was chipper too, and I asked her what happened, and she said that shortly after I had left, my brother came out of his coma. He was doing so well, in fact, that the doctors had already downgraded his status from critical to fair. I was relieved to hear that he was still alive, but Danny's recovery had raised a very disturbing question. If my brother wasn't dead, then how had I been talking to him on the phone in the kitchen? The according to the doctors, he even regained consciousness before I had made it home. They told us my brother would make a full recovery, and by the afternoon, we were allowed into his hospital room to talk to him. I was happy for him and his family, but the mystery of who I had been talking to during my phone conversation was still weighing heavy on me. After I got home from the hospital, I stayed up late, waiting for the phone in the kitchen to ring. I had questions that needed answers, and this time I wasn't going to let my caller pivot away from them. I had been waiting for hours when the phone finally rang. It was my brother again. Or at least, someone who sounded just like him. I let the voice speak for a little while before I cut it off. I then explained to the caller that my brother hadn't died in his car accident and that I no longer believed my phone line to the afterlife to be genuine. The voice on the other end of the line tried to continue its charade for a bit, but conceded when it realized that it had been caught in a lie. I'm just so lonely, the caller wheezed. Please, won't you still talk to me? Now the voice sounded like my grandmother's. I can be anyone that you want me to be. The revelation made me feel sick. Whoever or whatever I had been talking to all this time had been impersonating my dead relatives and friends in order to get closer to me. I disconnected the phone from the wall and tossed it into the garbage bin. Part of me was terrified that the phone would continue to ring, that whoever I'd hung up on would begin to bombard me with call after call until I picked up the receiver. But the calls never came. And I thank God for that, because I don't know what I'd do if they'd had. It's been years since that phone call, and even today, I feel violated just writing about it. I wonder sometimes what I was actually speaking to on the other end of the phone line. But the more I think about all the intimate phone calls we shared, the more I reflect on its strange attachment to me, the more I believe I'd rather not know. That's The Phone in the Kitchen by Vincent and Acaba. So, one of the things I want to be able to do that's going to separate this from story time is that I want to actually kind of go over that story with you guys a little bit. So The Phone in the Kitchen is a story that mixes together. It doesn't have any elements of gross out to it. You liked it? Yeah, cool, thank you. It doesn't have any elements to gross out to, but it does mix together the amount of growing tension that we have and changes your emotion along with the character that as he's going through it. So mainly we're writing towards the character in this one, and as his emotions change, so should they change in the reader. And the main way we're doing that is using terror and then switching that terror over to horror. So he has a paranormal phone, but in no way is that paranormal phone anything like anything really terrifying. We know that it's wrong. We know that there's a level of tension in us that kind of knows that he's going to have something weird happen with his phone because it's wrong. It's not something that's natural for him to have. And we kind of come to expect that maybe something's going to go wrong with the phone as it continues to build. There's tension that kind of becomes sad whenever we know that his brother's going to die, but we know that something wrong is going to happen with that phone. Eventually, when we realize that what's wrong is not that there's something wrong with the phone, but there's something else that's trying to get closer to him, that terror about something being wrong now has a physical manifestation or something similar to it that we know is something that's trying to get closer to the character, could potentially get closer to us, and that level of horror changes over to being horror instead. So it kind of blends both of them together in an interesting way. If you guys have ever seen a lot of shorter creepypastas, a lot of times they kind of just go for one thing, and they don't let themselves kind of blend across. I'm trying to think of one. I really love doing this one story. I'm not going to do it today because I didn't tell you about it, so I'm not going to do it. Yeah. It's called Symmetry. And there's a story I really love doing about a guy who puts a spoon under his eye and starts digging his eye out. And he pops his eye out, and see, this is why I wasn't going to do it here. And he snips it, and then he does the same thing to his other eye the next day, but he can't see it as he's doing it. It's really neat how the way they do it, but it really keeps you at only one steady emotional level. And whenever you're writing internet horror, one of the things that really kind of draws a lot of people in, and like even when it comes down to doing like any kind of writing that you want to be able to do, not necessarily even horror, is to having those variations in emotion throughout your characters so they can carry over to your reader. You want to do the next one? Heck yeah, brother. So we went through one of them. Normally I would do like, oh yeah, this is the gross out one, and I do the one about the eyeball squishing. But I have a different one I want to be able to do because I've never done this one at a convention before. Also, I think you guys would be able to enjoy it. It is one that mixes, yeah. See, okay, so how exactly do you play to gross out is what you're saying? Like, or did you want specifically gore is what you're asking about? It doesn't necessarily have to be, like, so your question is specifically how does it feel like it's not a cop-out with gore, and how does it actually feel like, I'm guessing, how does it actually like feel like it's tangible? How does it actually speak to somebody emotionally? It deals with what exactly you're seeing to be gory. And that's the best way to be able to answer that question, because I mean, I'm going to take some questions at the end of this too, because I know I'm just going to kind of glaze over this stuff. But really, the best thing to do is, one, whenever you're doing with gore, play to your senses, because that's what you're talking about. If you guys are thinking about gore, it's the same way I was discussing, like, whenever there's carpeted kitchen, you're going to be seeing something, you're going to be feeling something, you're probably going to be hearing something. So it's going to be squishing down between your toes, which is like a sound that you'll hear was the squish. You'll be able to feel water going between your feet, and then you'll be able to like actually see it and visually explain what it looks like. That would be the real way to do it. But also, like, an emotional tie is really what goes there. So building up a story about why this is taking place is really how it works. There was a Saw video game that came out a couple years ago. You guys probably remember seeing Saw. It was terrible because, like, not because, like, probably, yeah, because it was a bad game, but also because, like, it had these things where it's like, there are, 7 living people around you in a room, and one of them has a key inside their stomach, and that's the only dead body in the room. So I was like, all right, and I just literally cut open 7 people and then found it. Because I didn't care, I don't know who these people are, and they're just video game characters. In Saw, it feels a lot more like a thing, because it's like, hey, these are like your 6 brothers that you have an emotional tie to, and one of them died, so you have to find the one that's dead and cut him open. Now there's suddenly like something invested into every single person that's there that I don't want to cut into. And I have a way of, especially whenever I'm writing or watching a film or something like that, of expressing that this person absolutely doesn't want to cut into the wrong person. But me as a player who has no idea who these people are, I can cut right into them. That's really a big way to do it, is like emotionally is what you want to play to. And honestly, like everything I always hated the term psychological horror, because like that goes to say that all horror is not psychological when all of it is. Like every element of it. A jump scare is all playing at your psyche. The gore is all playing at your psyche. Everything like that is always going to be playing towards manipulating your reader, manipulating your audience in an emotional or a psychological way to make sure that they are able to feel empathy towards whatever is going on in your scene. And that's the real way to get difference between cheap and something that you actually like can feel, or something you can actually relate to, is letting them feel like empathy towards these characters by giving them enough to hang on to by it. Cool? Cool. Every time I answer a question, it's going to be a long journey, but I'm going to bring it on back to it. Let's go to this one real quick, because this is going to be somewhat of a longer one, but then we're going to move into, I'll just start popping up questions about stuff, answering questions about writing and stuff. Cool? We all down for that? Sweet. I visited the town that the house was located in during the summer of this past year. I thought that meeting people face-to-face would be a good opportunity to learn more about the house on Wendell Lane, but I noticed quickly that my inquiries were met with a strange resistance from most of the locals I questioned. Many were not interested in speaking to me. Others were standoffish whenever I brought up the house. I did get a few people to agree to sit down with me, but my interviews with them had yielded little to nothing in regard to the information I wanted to hear. I was almost ready to give up when I received a voicemail on my phone. I arrived at AJ's that night around 10 p.m. The bar was a total dive. Low-light neon signs, the air that reeked with stale beer and sweat, and I couldn't help but wonder if the anonymous caller was watching me as I scanned the room. I also wondered if anyone the caller had warned me about was about there too. I asked the bartender if she knew where or whether or not Bill Huxley was in the establishment that night, and she pointed me to a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a 5 o'clock shadow shooting pool in the back of the bar. It was Bill. I made my way over and introduced myself to him, just as the voicemail had promised. Bill was more than willing to talk to me about the house. And when I asked him about Jim Baker, his face lit up with an empathetic eagerness. We picked out a table and sat down. I turned my tape recorder on, and that's when his story began. Yeah, I knew Jimbo. Jimbo's what I called him. Played in my fantasy football league last year. Good guy, but the dude was a total fish. Drafted a kicker in the 3rd round, easy money. Haven't been doing too well this season, so I just picked up the Buffalo second-string running back, and now I'm one blown ACL away from riding this horse to the playoffs, baby. You see, the key is to snag the guys who back up the guys with the brittle bones and tendons that snap like little Kit Kat bars, and that's really just about playing the waiting game. What are we talking about? Oh yeah, Jimbo. He was a real mousy-looking cat. Short, skinny. He had a beard, but he kept the thing so neatly trimmed that it looked like he painted it on his face before he left the house every morning. Wore thick glasses. One of the smartest guys you could have ever met, unless he was talking about football. I think he was one of those, well, not hippie, what do they call them now? Yeah, hipsters. That's it. Anyway, I ain't saying that he was nothing, but you know, Jimbo came in the bar every weekend, and not only did I ever see him with a woman, but you think he'd be cleaning up too, because he was pretty well off for a guy in his early 30s. Drove a Benz, made a bunch of money in tech, then decided that he wanted to take a break from the fast life. Apparently, he had a public freak out a ways back while he was running away with some .com up in the city. Said the stress had been building up in him in years. Suppose that's why he moved out here and bought the house. Oh, speaking of the house, I guess you probably heard the stories, huh? You know, it's taken pretty seriously if you came all the way from California just to follow up on the place. As for me, I never believed in rumors. Every town's got its silly urban legends, and ours no different. Every time something happened in that house, this community would work themselves into an uproar, which meant that I would have to hear people ramble on about the place for weeks on end. All the while, I'm going on but that maybe the only reason that old McNeely suddenly dropped dead in her living room was because old McNeely was 102 years old. Seriously. A geriatric bag of bones was so ancient when she farted, sawdust would come out of her ass, and people actually wanted to call in an exorcist the day she finally up and croaked. Now, have no fear, buddy. You ain't leaving here empty-handed. I know you flew up here for a story, and trust me when I tell you this, I got a story for you. Before I tell it, I'm gonna need a drink. I'll get this round, you get the next. Bartender, 4 shots of Jack, and what'll you be having? It started about 6 months back. I was here at the bar when Jimbo walked in. He sat down right there at the table, if I remember correctly. And Trashy Tammy came over and took his order. The guy looked like hell. He was sweating bullets, and his face was, whiter than the North Pole. At this point, he'd grown into a pretty good acquaintance, drinking buddies. So I could tell that something was really bugging him when he didn't come up and say hi. He was just sitting, staring off into space, not even touching his cheese fries. So I decided to mosey on over to see how he was doing. I sat down at the table and started picking away at his food, and before I even got to ask him what his deal is, it all comes pouring out of him. Tells me he saw a cockroach in his kitchen. Says he couldn't stand the thought of being under the same roof with the thing. And I asked him why he didn't just kill it. And get this, tells me he tried and just about burned his house down in the process. Good old Jimbo tried to roast the roach with one of those fancy blowtorches people use to brown the tops of creme brulee, but the sucker darted away and his wallpaper caught instead. And now I'm laughing so hard at the guy, I nearly fall out of my chair. Can you imagine almost setting your house on fire because you're too chicken to mush a bug? It's even funnier to me because I run a pest control company, second biggest privately owned in the region, thank you very much. So killing bugs is something that comes naturally to me. Now, once I catch my breath, I tell him that I'll send over one of my guys to his place in the morning, and if he needs somebody to take care of it, that cheers him up right away. He hires me on the spot, buy him a beer. He doesn't mention the cockroach for the rest of the night. Good morning. And I tell Miguel, my most trusted soldier, to spray Jimbo's house down. And once he finishes, Miguel shoots me a text to let me know that everything was capiche. But That afternoon, I get a call from Jimbo. His voice is trembling on the phone. He says the cockroach isn't dead. His voice is really jumpy, and he's asking me how long it takes before the poison starts working. Now, I'm not sure how much you understand about the delicate science of pest control, but my guys aren't messing around with this wimpy junk you get over the counter. We only use the very finest insecticides on the market, and any roach exposed to the powerful poisons employed in our arsenal should be belly up within a matter of minutes. So the fact that Jimbo was saying that we didn't get the job done was really starting to bug me. Pardon the pun. So I ask him if he's sure the cockroach is still alive, and he tells me that he's looking at it on the wall in his bathroom and that it's even bigger than before. At least 4 inches long, not including the antennas. That's a big effing roach. As a matter of fact, the only cockroach that even is known to grow that large is the Blabberus giganteus, otherwise known to the layman like yourself as the giant burrowing cockroach of Australia. And those are only native to Australia. So I tell Jimbo that I'm coming down myself to scope that whole situation out, and when I get there, the guy opens the door and he's shaking like a meth head coming down from a 3-day bender. And on top of that, he's nursing a pretty nasty lump on the back of his head. Tells me that after he got off the phone, he cornered the thing in his bathroom and swatted at it with a rolled up newspaper. Nailed it, dead on. And didn't budge 1 inch. When he reared back to whack it again, the cockroach went on the offensive. It fluttered its wings, then launched itself at him and buzzed around in his face. He tells me he let out a yelp in all the excitement, and in that moment, the second or two his lips had been involuntarily parted, the bug manages to somehow force its way into his mouth. Said its back end was sticking out of his lips like a cigar, so good old Jimbo panics, stumbles backwards, trips over the bathtub, and damn near knocks himself out when he bangs his melon against the wall. After it does its damage, the roach just casually crawls out of his mouth and buzzes away. Now, the Blabberus giganteus can't fly, so Jimbo's story ruled out the possibility of that, but never heard of any other type of roach growing even half that size, so I figured that he must have been exaggerating. Now, while I'm at his place, I check the pantry for droppings and eggs, because anything that I can use to identify as an unwelcome guest, but I can't find a thing. Most people would be relieved to hear that, because that would mean that they likely weren't dealing with an infestation, but most people aren't as high-strung as Jimbo was. He asked if he could tent the place, and normally I'd strongly against fumigating a house for one solitary roach. I mean, why pay thousands of dollars to accomplish the same thing I could do with the sole of my boot? It's kind of like dropping a live hand grenade down your pants to scratch your ass. But as I look into his eyes, I can see just how hot and bothered that bug has him, so I reluctantly agree, and I schedule him in my next earliest appointment. Well, 2 days later, the tent goes up over his house. Hey, don't look at me. Okay, it's not like that he couldn't afford it. I was helping out a pal. I even let him crash at my place while we gassed his place. Then once the tent goes up, he shows up at my place with a duffel bag full of clothes, a smile on his face so big that you would have thought that he just hit the super lotto jackpot. My wife made meatloaf that night. I mean, it tasted like dog chow, and Jimbo gobbled it down like he hadn't eaten in days. After dinner, me and Jimbo go down to the den, have a beer. I ask him if he's seen the cockroach again, since he has run in with it in the bathroom. Tells me that things have been quiet as of late, but he caught a glimpse of it that morning before my guys showed up to fumigate his house. He was walking to the front door when it scuttled past him in the foyer. Said it almost jumped out of his skin when he saw it, and according to Jimbo, the roach was about a foot long now, maybe 6 inches tall. Have you ever heard of a cockroach that big? Yeah, me neither. But I'm pretty sure that in all of my line of work, in fact, I hadn't found any signs of a roach at his place at all. Neither had Miguel. So then I get to thinking about how anxious Jimbo is all the time. And I remember he told me about the nervous breakdown that he had that prompted him to retire early and move away from the city. So I start to wonder if the whole cockroach thing is just a figment of his imagination. See, the roach is all the guy can talk about while he's staying with me. He's obsessed. For the next 2 days, it's cockroach this, cockroach that. My wife has the patience of a saint, but she's better if she's gonna be staying married to me, but even she was starting to get annoyed when this blabbering. And I could tell that she was relieved a couple days later when we took the tent down and told Jimbo it was safe to move back in. You know, I really hoped that would be the end of it. But the evening after dinner, I get a knock on my door, and when I open it, it's Jimbo. And he's an absolute wreck. He's standing on my doorstep in his PJs with one house slipper on, and I can tell he's been crying. I ask him what happened. He tells me he was reading a book in bed when he heard a hissing sound. The noise was coming from directly over his head, so he looked up, And there on the ceiling was the roach. As big as a dog, he tells me. Said it was staring at him and fluttering its wings like it was about to strike again. So he rolled himself out of bed, sprinted out of the bedroom like it was on fire. He had phoned the cops, but they told him that he shouldn't be calling 911 about a cockroach. And that's why he came to me. Now, at this point, I'm positive Jimbo's lost it. I know my wife's gonna kill me if I let him stay another night on the couch, so I invite him in, I give him a beer, tell him to relax while I take care of his roach situation. But sometimes what a person needs is just good old-fashioned validation, then to catch up with his fantasy and make a difference in what's real and what isn't. Only thing you can do here is just to indulge him. My crazy Aunt Laura taught me that. She was convinced the government was secretly run by lizard people from the Sirius star system. Anyway, I asked him for his key, and I headed out to his place. When I get there, I let myself in the front door. I look around Jimbo's house, and just as I expected, the place is empty, even the bedroom. So I send a text to Jimbo, and it reads something like this. Whoa, you were right. That's a big sucker. Got it, though. Nailed it point blank in the face with enough insecticide to kill a horse. Executed the bastard just in time, too, because it looks like it was getting ready to lay eggs. Gonna dispose of the body properly before the larvae hatch. Be back in 15 minutes. Now, after I'm done, I leave my hat on his kitchen counter just in case he had any doubts that I had actually come by. I thought I was being pretty crafty, but Jimbo didn't buy my ruse. No matter what I said, he refused to go back inside his house until I showed him the corpse. Couldn't help but feel guilty when I told him he couldn't spend the night at my place anymore, but he seemed to understand. Heard he crashed at Richie Hooper's for about a week before Richie's wife kicked him out. Then he spent a couple days at Peter Dunn's. After he exhausted all his friends, he started shacking up at the budget motel just off the interstate. And I didn't see him come around much after that. Stopped coming to the bar. And then all of a sudden, the cops show up. They start asking questions. Turns out that he went missing. Melanie Swan was the last to see him. She lived across the street. Said she watched him head inside his house with a brand new hunting rifle. He walked in, but never walked out. It's weird, huh? Yeah, it gets weirder. Remember how I left my hat over at his place? Well, I'd forgotten all about it when I finally remembered where it was. Jimbo was already long gone, but I still have the spare key he gave me, so I drive on over there after work one day and I let myself in the front door. The house is a mess. The chairs are knocked over. The glass coffee table in his living room is broken. The place stinks to high hell and back, and I'm thinking it's pretty obvious that Jimbo must have gone off the deep end. I'm feeling really sorry for the guy, but then I start to hear a noise coming from the kitchen. It sounds like they're shuffling around in there. I'm thinking maybe Jimbo came back. I call out his name, but all I hear is more shuffling and then some kind of crunching, like somebody biting into an apple. I wonder if there's a burglar in there instead. I'm against the wall right next to the kitchen door now. I can hear that there's definitely someone in there, so as quietly as I can, I peer around the corner. That's when I see it. Jimbo's cockroach. It's just as real as you or me. It's enormous. If I had to guess, I'd say close to 7 feet long. Standing next to you, it would have come up to about your hip. Its antennae are as long as my legs, and the thing's eyes are like 2 black softballs. Its mandibles look like industrial-sized pruning shears. Right away, I recognize the stench in the house is coming from it. It doesn't smell like an ordinary roach infestation. I would have been able to pick up on that immediately. No, this is way more pungent. There's really no describing it. Took 2 days to get the stink out of my nostrils, and it still comes back to me from time to time like an acid flashback. The thing is eating something. For a second, I think it's a loaf of bread from Jimbo's pantry, but as it spins it in its mouth, I see a face. Jimbo's face. I hear another sickening crunch and realize that noise is the sound of my old pal's skull cracking inside the giant cockroach's maw. I try to back away slowly, but the thing spots me and flutters its wings. The sound is horrific, like 1,000 angry bees getting ready to swarm me. Each beat of its wings hits me with a wave after a wave of that noxious stink that it produces, and I'm pretty sure that it wants to attack me, but lucky for me, it's too big to take off in Jimbo's tiny kitchen, so it settles down again and goes back to chewing on the poor guy's head. I take that as my cue to hightail it out of there. I book it out the door, hop in my car, put the pedal to the metal, and when I get far enough away, I make an anonymous call to the cops to tell them I saw an armed gunman break into Jimbo's old house. But what was I supposed to say? There's a giant cockroach eating my missing friend's head. By the time the police arrived, the roach was gone. Never did find Jimbo's body, but I don't think anybody ever will. I believe the stories about that house now. I believe all of them. I keep wondering if I'm going to get a call one day from the next people who buy that place. And if I do, I'll tell them to give Orkin a ring. 'Cause I'll never stop, and I'll never set foot in there again. There's something wicked about that house. Now, it's your turn to buy the round, and don't be cheap. Make mine a double this time. That's Big F and Roach by Vincent and Acaba. So, in that one, like when we're talking about like manipulating like emotions and things, like there's a big thing I generally like to do when it comes down to any kind of like writing of stories, and that's mixing in comedy. Like obviously, we'd written this one for Bruce Campbell to record, and he recorded that one on the channel. But it's very much written in kind of Bruce Campbell's voice. He's very comedic with how he's speaking. He uses a lot of idiom and things like that. But majority of the time, it kind of keeps you at like a low tension level. Like, yeah, we have a lot of like really gross things that are happening to Jim. Every so often, like the roach pops into his mouth, or other like really gross things will take place with him. But for the most part, it's kept very low because of the comedic elements that are tied to it. We don't let our emotions get too high until suddenly you're realizing that when he went back in the house and something is wrong. We're well aware of the fact that something tension-wise, something terror-wise is wrong. But once something is wrong that's happening here, there's a big stench that's coming into him, and we can actually see what that cockroach is. And suddenly it starts going from that terror towards horror. We know there's something that's potentially going to be that has killed Jimbo, could potentially end up killing Bill, and that changes that horror over. Anybody here afraid of cockroaches, by the way? Are you? Yeah, that's Vincent and Acaba right there giving me the finger out the door. Are you afraid of cockroaches? Dude, same. You should have seen some of the ones we had in my old house. They were like, yeah. Juicy ones.
Ew.
That's really what the gross out kind of plays to, right? And like even when you want to talk about like how do you make gross out not feel cheap? Like one of the things is he talks about how it's a stink that smells like a cockroach. And I don't think any of us really have gotten up to a cockroach and just been like, yeah, no. But he's saying like it smells like a cockroach, but it's a stink that's so strong it's able to stay in his nostrils for weeks. And I think we can at least imagine something like that. And it comes at him in wave after wave when the wings are beating. He talks about the sound like that he's biting into the head, and it sounds like crunching on an apple. These are all different like playing to your senses that really kind of bring out what makes it gross, because we can relate to what these sounds are, and it feels like we're able to experience it. We're able to empathize with what those things are. I mean, like seeing a giant cockroach is enough to empathize with horror, because fuck that. But those are really like the elements of what I wanted to say about like writing for horror, is including these elements and blending those elements together. Not necessarily blending them together all the time in every single scene. You need to have all three elements there. But as you can see in like those stories, they kind of move from one to the next, and sometimes even just move back away from that. So like in that last one, yeah, we have low points. We have points of gross out, but it moves back down to that low point, which gives us a constant flow of emotion throughout. And also, like, when Jimbo died, we actually kind of feel something for it. We knew something bad was going to happen to this guy, but we're just not sure if he's going to lose it himself or if it's actually going to be a cockroach that's going to get him. And it was. Yeah, anybody out here writer, they want to write their own creepypasta stories? You? Yeah? Me too. If you guys have got any like actual questions like about your writing techniques or things like that, go ahead and raise up your hands. We got a couple of minutes. Nico, feel free to play whatever you want to play. Ha! I knew it! I knew that was coming! I knew that was coming. Yeah, what's your question?
This is more of a comment and a question.
Yeah.
The first story that you read, strangely enough, I wasn't scared.
See, like, it doesn't necessarily deal with, like, you're not trying to make somebody scared all the time. This is one of the things that I talk about writing for internet horror, is it's really hard to do this. Like, take a look around yourselves real quick when I ask this question. Who here is afraid of clowns? Cool. Who here is afraid of the dark? Cool. Who here is hydrophobic? Who here is afraid of the water? The point is that at no point did anybody have their hands up for everything. it's really impossible to scare all of the people all the time, and especially if all of you guys enjoy consuming horror, it's very easy to just desensitize yourself to it. And that's why like you end up getting this point where it's like, man, things today aren't as scary as they used to be. It's because they're never going to be as scary as they used to be because you weren't used to it back then. These kind of stories aren't meant to always be, and you're not trying to always try to top yourself. I'm not trying to make the scary story every single time that I'm writing something. Whenever you want to create a new story, I think the best thing to focus on is creating a good horror experience. So you know that you're creating something that's disturbing, you know you're creating something that creates a horror scenario, and telling a good story along with it, which is why I'm saying, like, really, what you're doing is you're manipulating emotion, and you're manipulating, like, on a psyche level to say that you recognize these as horror scenarios, and if you're telling a good story with it, then you know your reader's going to be able to enjoy it. Because if you always try to focus on, I'm just going to create the next most shocking, the next top, the next whatever it is, just going to try to top myself on that, then you become really focused on a lot of shock value more than you are focused on, like, the overlasting staying power of your writing technique, or overlasting staying power of the product that you're creating. Is that cool? Yeah, sweet. Yes.
So, one of my favorite stories by you is actually, I don't remember the specific name of it, but it was about the Wendigo. There was something involving a dream catcher. And,
The stolen tongue story.
in your opinion, how were you able to like keep that tension building across such a long series?
See, like, whenever it's going on with series, I'm trying to remember who wrote that one. Stolen Tongues it's a full novel, actually, that's available, and I have it, so let me find the authors real quick. Really, like, what he did when it comes down to Stolen Tongues was he was, at least I think the best way that he kind of created that was he just constantly had a mystery that takes all of his characters. It's Felix Blackwell who wrote that one. Felix Blackwell wrote Stolen Tongues, and he created a mystery, and he uses a technique that like all primetime shows use, which is just 2 steps forward, 1 step back. If you guys ever watch any kind of like, I guess I never watched Game of Thrones. If you guys watch like Supernatural, if you guys used to watch Walking Dead or anything like that, all it really does is it's just 2 steps forward and then 1 step back every time that an episode takes place, which is he establishes characters that you enjoy. So we have our main character and his wife. We have 2 characters that we know that they're enjoyable, and in the first episode, he very much establishes that there's just something wrong outside, but these 2 are just trying their best to have a good weekend together, and they have a good relationship. So we know they're enjoyable characters, and each episode after that is something goes wrong, and our main characters are going to do something to try to prevent that or solve a mystery that they're given within this story. Once they move 2 steps forward towards making progress for it, then towards the end of it, we realize that that progress that was made wasn't actually progress at all. And then it puts us our 1 step back. But it still progresses towards what eventually becomes the resolution. We eventually discover what the curse is at the end of it and what he needs to do to solve the curse. But like everything he's given, this will solve the curse, 2 steps forward. And then like it doesn't actually happen because the ring's not there, 1 step back. There's 2 guys who are like medicine men that are able to solve this curse for you, and they're going to come to the cabin. Awesome, 2 steps forward. One of them dies, the one who's most experienced. You're left with the one who doesn't know what he's doing, 1 step back. Every single thing is still a standalone story on its own that focuses on telling a good story, but it's just playing off of emotional manipulation to let you know that something's going to happen, we're going to get tension that's going in a good direction, and then like once it's released, because like it doesn't actually happen, it pulls you back towards it. That's a writing technique that Primetime uses. Like that's like a successful series. I'll try to think. Homestuck. If anybody here is into Homestuck, that's exactly how Homestuck was put together. Except like they left a lot of loose ends as he keeps going to eventually be able to pick them up as he went along. But that's honestly like the best technique to be able to use for that. Let's see. I had a hand. What's up?
Tales from the Gas Station, I really think is an interesting writing because it starts out very comedic, very kind of fun, and well, this has horror elements. It gets more lighthearted. But now that the series has gone on, we've had a detective spin-off, we've gone off to this, and now it's honestly become a lot more horror backbound than comedy almost. So how do you spin that? How do you do that?
The way that Jack did it, is he wanted to write a comedy story. So he wrote, at least I believe this is how it went, at least watching the way that it came out and then like talking to him a bit, is he wrote he wrote the first couple bits of the Tales from the Gas Station, like the first bit of the series of season 1. And when he got all those in, it was like this kind of comedy series. He apparently had like a bunch of stuff like kept going off. If anybody here writes, you know, like as soon as you like put pen to paper on the very first one, your mind is already kind of taken off. You kind of already have like these grand ideas that you already know what you want to do. These characters have these big backstories. The characters have these big futures that you want to be able to have for them and things like that. So he's apparently started plotting all these things out from the very beginning. And what he actually went into after a while was when he realized he was going to novelize it, that he was, okay, so let's fill in all the gaps. He uses, I think he uses anyway, it seems like he does, this kind of plotting technique is the same way I do, which is he had a central idea that he wanted to work off of, and then he kind of creates like a thought plot off of that, but instead of it, he kind of created like a timeline and started thought plotting off of that to say what pieces can be able to fill in to make the most sense to get to the next point in time. So he created all these different points, and now I think he was telling me he's almost done with volume 2 for his second novel, but he had volume 2 was I gotta cut it off now because that's enough to be volume 3. So I think one of the real things that started blending more into horror was the fact that once he started sitting down and being like, okay, this is the serious plot that's taking place, once he started filling in all those gaps, his writing voice is naturally very comedic, but once the plot starts moving, it's just a serious enough plot. I mean, to be fair, Jack goes through a lot of, the character Jack goes through a lot of really serious things. He just takes it all in stride. But even if you read Tales from the Gas Station Volume 1, it has a very serious tone. Jack is still kind of really aloof with, the people kind of die around me and stuff like that. But when people are dying around him in at least the novel, he's kind of like, I kind of spent weeks talking to this person, and now that he's not here, I don't get to talk to him anymore. So it does have a serious twist to it, as opposed to that guy was an asshole every time he came to the gas station, and then he got ripped apart in front of the place. So I think that's just kind of him developing his voice, his writing voice a bit more, and developing the plot kind of turns in that direction. That's one of the things. Whenever you're writing, really your writing voice is one of the hardest things to come about. And I'll give you one piece of advice that I had seen before. Has everybody got one of these? It's a phone. Yeah. Do you guys remember before this? I'm running out of time. I got 3 minutes left, so this will be the last piece of advice I got on this. Before we had these where you could text whatever the hell you wanted to or however long you wanted to, there was always a 255 character limit. It changed the way we talk to each other. Because it suddenly started developing things we'd all say BRB, LOL, LMAO, and things like that. We had to develop a way to be able to discuss, get our entire idea out there, but only within that number of characters whenever we were texting back and forth, or we wanted to use messengers back and forth. And by limiting the amount of characters, by limiting yourself, you developed your own way of speaking. Because some of us decided, I don't care how many characters it is, I'm gonna use proper punctuation, this has gotta be capitalized, there's gotta be a period at the end of sentences and things like that. Some, for me, I was I'm never gonna just use the letter U, it's Y-O-U, and that's how it is, because it's proper. We all developed our own way of doing that. If you guys are wanting to really get practice with writing, writing is an art the same way as drawing is, the same way that painting is, and the same way that you would get better at writing is going to be by writing every day. And that's hard to say, because I know whenever you think about writing, you're I'm going to start working on a novel, and I got to sit down, I got to write more to my novel every day, which isn't how you're going to do that. You're not going to sit down and paint a leather inch on the end of a painting to be able to practice painting. What you want to do is you want to sit down and write throwaway things every day, which is hard because you want to get invested in things. You want to emotionally invest yourself. One of the things that Vincent, the guy who gave me the finger a second ago, the one thing that he had told me about doing was vomit drafts, which is he wakes up, gets to his computer in the morning, doesn't have coffee, he just sits down, and he just starts typing something out. And he's just got 1,000 words. That's the limit. You can't go over that, because I know a lot of people, I've read your creepypastas, I've read your fan fictions, you love to go way over that, you love to get overly descriptive, but you can't do that anymore when you only have 1,000 words. So you limit yourself 1,000 words to get from the beginning, the middle, the end, and it doesn't have to be good. You don't have to write something good. You don't have to judge yourself based on that, because this is for you to just type out and then throw away. So you type out whatever it is, and then you put that into a folder, and then you never look at it again. But you can look at it again, because those are your drafts, those are your ideas. So whenever you want to sit down and actually start working on something, you have a whole list of things you wrote in the morning. And you could pull one up and be like, this is a lamp that catches fire one morning, and a person the size of the mouse has to try to put it out before the whole house catches. And you're like, that's a terrible idea. But let's explore maybe somebody stuck in a burning house. You can be able to pull these things out. It's going to help you with writer's block and things like that. But most importantly, this is going to help you develop a voice that you know that you're able to write in, and help you develop ideas that you know you're going to be able to complete. That's the best piece of advice you guys are getting all night. So my time is up. Thank you guys for coming. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I know this is different from the writing other panels we've done before. This is Muji, and Mew is wonderful for always accompanying me with music. I love the guy. We're going to be right outside there. The book that I was reading from here is available out there too if you guys are interested. Thank you guys.
Thank you for coming. That's fine.